So earlier this week, I did a discussion, or perhaps one could call it a debate, with the YouTuber Godless Engineer on the subject of anti-theism, which is pretty much what he dedicates his own YouTube channel to discuss. Now, a lot of people who watch my channel have urged me to interact more with the atheist community, and in particular the anti-theist community. And I think this is because I'm a fairly prominent religious believer on YouTube, which is a medium that has had a reputation for quite some time now as being the home for atheism and secularism. But of course, being a person who likes discussing ideas, I've had very little interest in discussing non-ideas, negations. Simply throwing one's hands up in the air and saying, well, I don't believe in this. I don't really care what people don't believe in. I'm concerned what people do believe in. They're positive ideas. They're models of the universe. And as such, I've been a little bit resistant to actually engage with people like Armored Skeptic. I don't need to hear atheism as a lack of belief for the 100th time. But the anti-theist movement interested me a little bit, so I was eager for the opportunity to discuss it, especially with someone from a more or less scientific background, as apparently Godless Engineer has. Now, of course, I'm not so sure what I was really expecting from this interaction, or even really what Godless Engineer was expecting from this interaction. But after talking with Godless Engineer for an hour and a half, I frankly don't know what anyone could have gotten out of it. What resulted was simply an extended, I hesitate to say, discussion over definitions. Basic definitions about what is religion, what is secularism, and of course, what is anti-theism, what motivates it, what does it mean? Now, the conversation was broadcast both on Godless Engineer's channel and my own, but for all intents and purposes, I was managing the live stream and the chat, and I was taking the initiative more or less to make this my mission to understand what Godless Engineer's anti-theism really meant. If someone stands up and tells me that he is against religion, he's anti-theistic, and he thinks this thing is harmful, well, I think there is a certain onus to be able to define these things in clear terms, so that I could go out into the world, look at human ideology, and recognize the kind of things that Godless Engineer is really against. Not simply a list of specific grievances against particular groups that Godless Engineer might not like in his current local society or in American politics at this particular moment. And for this reason, I definitely made a big point about trying to understand the definitions that Godless Engineer was using. What is a religion? Is Confucianism a religion? Is Platonism a religion? Is communism a religion? What is a theocracy? Does any time a religious person in government vote on a law as motivated by his religious ethics? Is that an element of theocracy? Or is theocracy something much more specific involving the rule by priests or religious interpreters? But of course, in my attempt to try to figure out what Godless Engineer meant by any of these terms, I immediately, right off the bat in my conversation with him, just encountered an incredible amount of resistance to trying to define terms in a succinct fashion. And there seemed this incredible willingness on his part to imagine that any attempt to understand by clarifying definitions was an assault on his worldview. It was some act of bad faith, as if everybody knew the definitions he had and we all could just proceed with the conversation. Or we could just keep the conversation going and use a loose or sloppy definition so that at one point Godless Engineer could claim that religion meant A, and at another point in the conversation he could claim it meant B. I could tell as the conversation went on, Godless Engineer was incredibly frustrated that I really was demanding that we develop succinct and consistent definitions and stick to them throughout the course of the conversation. I could get the sense that Godless Engineer didn't want to get caught up in these details. He wanted to go on a list of grievances about the bad things religions have done. He wanted to establish some heroic narrative about how atheists resist them. He did not want to get involved in some definition that we could go to history with and say, well, these societies were religious and these societies weren't. He didn't want to come up with some definitions that might be applied in a way that was not the one he originally intended in his narrative. And of course, I just wasn't having any of this. There was no reason to. I've heard the atheist narrative before of the eternally oppressed non-believer. of every generation being a Galileo in the face of a tyrannical and intransigent religious authority. I've heard all these narratives. I believed them when I was an atheist. But if we were going to get anywhere in the development of the idea, we would need to have some kind of definition formally so that it could be applied not just in the form of story or fable, but operatively going into the future, taking on cases that neither I nor him really thought about or had confronted. And of course, a lot of people criticized me for perhaps a too aggressive debate style. I had no intention of letting Godless Engineer go on these tangents, and when he was taking a non-topical turn, I certainly interrupted him, perhaps improperly so. And of course, that's not typically good form. You should give your opponents more room to maneuver. And I thought perhaps I could have been more laid back. Perhaps I could have had this be more of a neutral dialectic as opposed to a very, very focused one on definitions. But having 24 hours to think about this problem, I don't know what the point of that would have been. I'm so incredibly tired of people playing language games. And this isn't just something that's attendant to the atheist community. As a matter of fact, progressives, both atheist and theistic, seem to be utterly committed to this way of thinking. I'm so tired of people building these houses of cards entirely based on classifying certain types of things with one word, that's the good word, and with another word, the bad word, for their opponents. And they have incredible narratives for this. They'll design their entire worldview around these terms. So, for instance, in Godless Engineer's mind, secular is a good word. Secular to him means without God or without explicit religion in the operation of some institution. But when confronted with the fact that communism was both atheist and secular, we can't permit the good word to be applied to the bad society or the bad people in that society. Therefore, we have to modify it and saying that communism can't possibly be secular. It's an entirely different thing, even though it meets the definition, so it technically is. Or we have to say that communism's atheism wasn't atheism, it was state atheism, meaning it's an entirely different thing, even though by the definition provided by atheism as just a lack of belief, it certainly qualifies. And of course, you see this on the left all the time as well. Whenever Antifa is up to its hijinks, whenever it starts engaging in violence, the radical defenders of the left-wing group will be out in force saying that most of what Antifa does, with a few extreme exceptions, is just speech. Whereas if you had a distant right speaker, a far right speaker, speaking at a college, well, their language is harmful. Therefore, their language is a type of violence. Well, is Antifa throwing a brick into a window a form of speech, even though it's violence, but speaking on a podium is violence, even though it's speech? I mean, all we're doing right now, all we're doing in that instance is calling the same behavior by different words when it comes from the opponent's side, when it comes from the hated side, and coming up with flowery, flattering terms for your own side's behavior. Oh, Israel isn't an ethno-state. Ethno-states are for evil Nazi people. Israel is a country for the Jewish people. And the Jewish people aren't a race or ethnicity. They're just a nation that happens to be culturally defined and inherited genetically. Once more, just shifting the definitions, just coming up with a neutral or flowery term for your own ideology's behavior. At this point, I'm so tired of dealing with this because it's the most meaningless, pointless thing of all time. You can have a conversation about the words you use for an hour and a half and still come to absolutely no conclusions. So to still never discuss actual ideas. It's a total waste of time. And, ignoring the problem and just letting people spin their narratives is equally a waste of time. And there have been no point. What am I going to do? Listen to Godless Engineer tell me about how modern American atheists are this generation's Galileo? Oh, wow, I haven't heard that one before. I mean, I almost entertained a digression on how the American religious right is trying to turn this country into a theocracy, which by the provided definitions would mean that priests would have to literally be installed as functionaries of the government, which hasn't been the case in a Western country well, since at least the 17th century. People need to be careful with their definitions. People need to be careful that they're using plain language. There's a certain amount of honesty, and radical honesty, in using words that are small, succinct, and using definitions for your own affiliation that are well established and don't involve elaborate exceptions. Because there's always the temptation to create flattering narratives through your own definition of the group you belong to. You don't want to catch yourself playing the no true Scotsman fallacy to save your own ego or your own group's sense of self-worth. But of course, it's kind of funny because people talk about no true Scotsman, and we've all heard it, and I'm sure a lot of the things I'm saying right now people have heard from other channels. But just from my own intellectual development, there's always a phrase I heard throughout my intellectual career, both as somebody who discusses ideas and somebody who participates in science. You always hear a strange phrase when something goes bad, when some person has some idea of how the universe works, and they see an instance of it failing. They see, oh, well, I guess the universe doesn't really work like this. Or perhaps I believe that, on average, Dalmatians are the best kinds of dogs, but whoops, I guess this Dalmatian turned out to be a bad dog and bit his owner. And when things like this happened very frequently in my life, people have said this weird little phrase. And they said, oh, I guess that's just the exception that proves the rule. I mean, the phrase never made very much sense to me. I heard it and I'm like, that makes absolutely no sense. If it's a rule, an exception would be a counterexample. And as all people who are mathematically inclined know, if you get one counterexample, it doesn't prove the rule, it disproves the rule. So if I were to say that Dalmatians are genuinely good pets, then if a Dalmatian bit somebody, that would be, well, if not damning evidence to the theory, considering it might be statistical, it would be some evidence against it. And so, like a lot of other adages that you could tell came from a really long time ago and may not have been very well thought through, I sort of filed away this phrase, the exception that proves the rule. I dismissed it as something that didn't make very much sense until I came across this problem, the existence of the contrived category or the contrived definition that exists only for the purpose of confirming an argument or confirming one in their political opinion or confirming one in their identity. And one way you can always tell you're dealing with a contrived definition, like the no true Scotsman, a definition that's designed to curl around all possible events and pick out just the instances where the person needs it to demonstrate their particular desired end. You know you're dealing with a contrived definition when that definition has no examples of it failing. When that definition has no examples where it doesn't quite do the ideological or the demonstrative work that the user wants it to do. The universe is a very complicated place, and the world we inhabit and this planet's a very big place. There is a multiplicity of different behaviors and effects going on all the time. As such, outside of fields like physics, and perhaps not even inside fields like physics when you really get down to the quantum level, most effects that we see in our everyday life are probabilistic. They have exceptions. They have instances where they don't quite hold. I could believe that Dalmatians are great dogs, but there's going to be some Dalmatians that bite people. There are going to be some Dalmatians that can't be house trained. There are going to be some Dalmatians that are really terrible dogs. I don't even know anything about Dalmatians. I'm fairly sure that's true. Why? Well, because I know how variation works, because I know how our universe works. If someone were to come to me with a named dog breed that never had these problems, that seemingly by its definition had no problems, it was just perfect all around, I might seriously suspect that this new defined dog breed was just a series of dogs that were selected on the basis that were good. That the population was selected on a criterion. And then after the criterion was established, the definition was derived to demonstrate that criteria. The label existed afterwards. It was contrived to demonstrate the point. Labels that are organic, labels that talk about actual simple things that we can witness, always have exceptions. Contrived labels do not. And so in that way, the exception proves the rule. It doesn't prove that the rule holds absolutely, none do, but it proves that the rule is organic. It proves that the rule describes a basic object in the universe that we can observe and possibly actually get some information from describing. Because if we create a contrived definition, like no true Scotsman, or like a definition of a dog breed that's always perfect, and that comes just from selecting the dogs that we already know are good, be part of this breed that we've totally invented out of thin air. These contrived definitions provide no information about the real world and have no predictive power. We want basic and organic rules about the universe, such that we can make observations and actually understand something going forward, not just redescribe something we've already observed and build it back into our language. Alright, so fair enough, but how does this apply to anti-theists, to people like Godless Engineer and my train wreck of conversation with him? Well, I think you see this same type of contrived definition going on. Not to be too blunt about it, but the identity I see Godless Engineer use when he defines himself as an atheist or an anti-theist, the type of identity that I see most new atheists use for themselves. It's an entirely contrived identity. It's an identity designed to make one believe that they're in the smart set, that they're in the world of thinkers, that they're among the people in the know. And for that matter, so are identities like progressive or progressivism. In both cases, in both the case of the identity of the new atheist and of the SJW progressive or the modern progressive of the Barack Obama variety, they imagine themselves part of a set of people. But the set of people is selected historically by hindsight. It's selected by understanding what was a good effect in history and going back through the ages and selecting people they think accomplish those good effects. For instance, take a character like Barack Obama, just as an example of a typical progressive who has this type of identity. What are Barack Obama's core principles? Well, if we really got down to it, it's the idea that technocratic management of society from a secular persuasion is the ideal way of bringing forward good results. That if the government uses experts trained by our best minds, it can make decisions for people in a way that's better for them than if they make them at the local level or by themselves. Barack Obama is, after all, someone who believes in a paternalistic and activist state, and he believes in a continuously progressing force of history that will always bend towards moral goodness. Okay, so that's a perfectly organic and non-contrived and basic way of describing Barack Obama's belief system. And it's something that is well-defined, or I could well-define it, such that I could bring a person, describe their beliefs, and you could tell me where they qualified or whether they didn't, regardless of whether you knew this person did good things or bad things. Of course, though, given that those are Obama's beliefs, or perhaps someone like Obama's beliefs, certainly if they aren't his actual beliefs, there's something close to that. Is that how Barack Obama identifies himself? Is that what he really sees himself as, if we were to take a broad historical perspective? Because if we went back 100 years in American history, the people that believed these things, of paternalistic government, of experts being able to decide things, of highly controlled technocratic society, those believers would be Woodrow Wilson, progressives that believed in eugenics, a lot of scientists that were pure racialists. Barack Obama doesn't see himself as part of that tradition. He doesn't see himself as in a room with those bad people as part of his lineage, because he doesn't actually identify with the organic statement of his beliefs. He identifies himself as a progressive, and a progressive means somebody who made the world better. And of course, this is the absolutely contrived identity. Because I know for a fact that when Barack Obama discusses his role in history, he imagines himself on the long line of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, of politicians like Thomas Jefferson, of civil rights figures like Malcolm X. those three people were all good. They were all great people that Barack Obama imagines are progressing the world because they did good things. We admire them. But regardless of the fact that he sees himself as a descendant of these people, as in communion with them spiritually because they both progressed the world, his beliefs are nothing like theirs. Locke and Jefferson believed in small government, in government that let localism thrive. The precise opposite of what Obama has pursued in his career. Malcolm X, while he may have been great for organizing the African American community, any objective analysis of X's beliefs they're basically just pure racial nationalism. And really have nothing to do with what Obama believes in, other than the fact that they're both going in a certain direction that Obama likes, and he sees himself as part of this narrative of progress. And the same thing is true with Godless Engineer. I'm sure he sees himself as a descendant, as an intellectual descendant of all these figures in history, from Roger Bacon to Isaac Newton to Galileo on down. Does it matter whether these people were religious or not? Not really. And of course, even though he might share his beliefs with people like Stalin and Lenin, they don't make up the same narrative. They may even be closer to his theological perspective, but he doesn't include them in the analysis. He doesn't see them as someone he could be like. And perhaps everyone does a little bit of this. But I think in order to be an honest intellectual, you really can't. You really have to stop yourself. If you're a Catholic, like I am, you have to acknowledge that in addition to Thomas More and St. Thomas Aquinas and Augustine being part of your intellectual tradition, being part of your group, you also have Torquemada, you also have Pope Boniface, you also have the corruption on display in the Medicis. And if I'm part of this ideology, if I'm part of this worldview, if I'm part of this religion called Catholicism, I have to acknowledge that I have a certain stake in those people, even if I don't like them, even if they did bad things. In a way, I really can't say that I have a stake in somebody who I admire, like Confucius or like Maimonides. And this applies to other ideologies as well. If you're a humanist, in some sense, you have to own the Jacobin. If you're a communist, in some sense, you have to own Stalin. And if you're a fascist, then you have to own Hitler. Now, does getting grouped in with these bad people discredit your ideology? Well, no, it really doesn't. I think we've been playing this game so long where we equivocate and create these fake and contrived identities for ourselves that we've forgotten that to be part of a group is to be part of a thing that has flaws, part of a thing that has evil people in it. We're under this false impression historically that there are some groups who are oppressor groups and some other groups that are innocent, but that's just a misunderstanding of human nature. It seems to fundamentally miss the point. We're not loving a real group. We're not loving a real humanity. We're loving a mannequinized and sterilized version of it because we can't admit to ourselves. We don't have the courage to admit to ourselves that we could be part of something evil, that people like us could do things that are evil. We don't have the humility to do it anymore. And I think that it's time just to be honest. It's time just to say we are part of groups and those groups have flaws. And hopefully we've learned from them. I think this is the only way to be an authentic thinker, to be someone who really owns their own affiliations. But it's also just the only way to be an authentic human being who has some identity outside of pure individualism. If true authentic identity is based on the premise that one should know thine self in both an individual and group sense, then we should start by knowing the flaws of the groups that we identify with, of the words that we apply to ourselves. The only truly authentic identity will come through humility. The only true way of saying, I am this or I am not that, will come once we admit that, well, really all labels we can put to ourselves or other people are a mixed bag. And of course, some people can't do this. Some people will never be able to do this. Many modern people haven't been trained to have the humility or the perspective to say, yes, my group did bad things and I'm still part of it. I'm still proud of it. But I don't think those people are serious, and I don't find their contrived identities to be enviable. In fact, the only thing that I can really muster is pity. But with that, those are all the thoughts that I can muster from my interaction with Godless Engineer. Although I do hope to have more conversations with people from the anti-theist community in the future, we'll have to find a different approach than was attempted at this last discussion. So with that, have a good evening and a wonderful night.